My brother was afraid of very few things in this world. Darkness held no dominion over him. Debt was a foreign country he had never visited. The whispered threat of social ruin that kept other men awake at 3 in the morning barely registered as a nuisance. He had stood in a peninsular rainstorm at 22 and come home unremarkable about it. He had managed the collapse of 3 estate partnerships, 2 floods, and 1 memorable incident involving a disputed will and the Lord Chancellor, and had done all of it without raising his voice above the level of calm, precise instruction. He was, in short, the sort of man who had arranged himself to be unmovable, and had found that most of the world was willing to treat him as such. But our grandmother, Lady Elspeth Carr, Dowager Duchess of Valcross, with her ivory-handled cane and her particular gift for the surgical smile, she gave him pause. She always had. She was 81 years old and had been giving the Duke of Valcross pause since the previous Duke of Valcross was alive to experience it, and she showed no signs of slowing. Which is why the morning she summoned him to her private sitting room and said, "I have found you a wife." I was listening from the corridor. Not eavesdropping, never eavesdropping. Merely standing in the vicinity of the door while tying an imaginary loose thread on my cuff. The silence that followed her announcement lasted long enough that I pressed my ear very lightly to the carved oak. "No," my brother said at last. His name was Aldrich, and he was the 8th Duke of Valcross, and he had delivered that single syllable with the calm authority that made ministers rethink legislation and servants rethink their life choices. Grandmother was undeterred. She had outlasted a king and 4 prime ministers. She was unmoved by calm authority. She had, in fact, been building toward this conversation since the spring, when Aldrich had declined his 3rd consecutive invitation to a house party at Carwick, and she had told me over cards that she did not intend to allow her grandson to wall himself into that estate and call it a satisfactory life. "You will meet her at Sunday's dinner," she said, as though he had not spoken at all. "She is staying with me for the fortnight. I have arranged it." Another silence, longer this time. "Who is she?" he said finally, and I heard in the question not consent but the reluctant gathering of intelligence. He was, whatever else, practical. He would want the shape of it. "A young woman of good mind and quiet character. Her father was a minor baronet of Devonswick, the late Sir Caulfield. She has been left with nothing. She came to my attention through the Widows' and Orphans' Society, and I have made inquiries. I am satisfied with what I found." "You are satisfied?" my brother repeated. His voice had gone very flat, which was, in my experience, more dangerous than if he had shouted. "Thoroughly," grandmother said. "She neither simpers nor schemes. She is not trying to catch a duke. She does not know she is being considered at all. I have told her only that she is here as my companion for the fortnight. She believes she is here to read to me in the evenings and help organize my correspondence." "And does she read well?" he said, which was not quite the question I expected, and which made me think he was already more interested than he was willing to show. "She reads extremely well," grandmother said. "She also has opinions about what she reads, which is a quality I find I prefer to the alternative." A third silence. This one I could not read. "I will attend your dinner," he said at last. "I make no promises beyond that." "I ask for none," grandmother said cheerfully. "Only that you sit at the same table and remember how to pass the salt." I retreated from the door in what I hope was an unhurried fashion, and went to find something to occupy myself in the library, already certain that Sunday would be the most interesting dinner the Valcross estate had seen in years. I was right, though not in the way I expected. Her name was Cora. I noticed her before my brother did, which says less about me than it does about the fact that he arrived late, as he always did, as though the entire room were simply required to hold its breath until the Duke of Valcross chose to fill it with his presence. Old habit, old armor. The feared Duke of Valcross had not earned that reputation by rushing to dinner. She was seated 3 chairs from the foot of the table, in the position grandmother reserved for guests she wanted her other guests to overlook until the moment she chose otherwise. She wore gray, a good gray, well-fitted, though the silk was not new, and her hair was arranged simply, no jewels, no artifice. She was speaking quietly with the clergyman beside her, and whatever she said made him laugh, and she received his laughter with a small, unguarded smile that she quickly composed again into polite attention. Not performing, just being. I watched a few of the other guests, Lady Fenwhistle, who had arrived with her 3 daughters arranged like a triptych of expectation, and Colonel Brackett, who assessed every room as though for fortification, glance at her and dismiss her in the same movement. Nobody. A companion, somebody's poor relation. Their eyes moved past her to the head of the table, where grandmother sat beneath the chandelier like a general surveying terrain. Then Aldrich entered. The room adjusted itself. That is the only way I can describe it, the collective posture of 12 people shifting a fraction as the Duke of Valcross crossed the threshold. He was not imposing in the theatrical way. He did not need to be. He simply took up the correct amount of space in a way that made you aware, suddenly, that everyone else was taking up slightly too much or too little. He took his seat at the head, nodded to grandmother, and cast the expected brief survey of the table. His gaze stopped. Not conspicuously, not in any way the room would have noticed, but I was watching specifically, and I saw it, the fraction of a pause at the gray-dressed woman 3 seats from the foot of the table, who was not watching him at all, and therefore was the only person in the room not watching him. He picked up his napkin. He spoke to grandmother about the state of the North Road. He accepted the first course. But twice more during the meal I observed his attention drift, very briefly and very precisely, to where Cora sat. She, for her part, did not look at him directly until he asked her a question. Grandmother had engineered the seating such that by the third course, conversation had separated into clusters, and the question Aldrich addressed to her was a perfectly ordinary one about whether she had any opinion on the autumn flooding in the lower counties, which the clergyman beside her had apparently raised as a topic. She looked at him directly then. Not startled, she did not startle easily, I would come to learn, but with the particular attention of someone who has been spoken to by someone unexpected, and is deciding whether to answer at face value or probe the intent behind the question. She answered at face value, clearly, concisely, without flattery. She had grown up in Devonswick, she said, and the lower county's drainage problem was one she knew in some detail, as her father's estate had suffered from it before the estate was, she paused there, only a breath before things changed. She offered 2 practical observations that were, frankly, more informed than anything the colonel had contributed on the subject. My brother listened to all of it. His expression to most of the table would have looked like polite attention. To me, who had observed it for 33 years, it looked like someone encountering a thing they had not anticipated, and not being certain yet what to do about that. Grandmother, at the head of the table, said nothing. She ate her pheasant with the serene expression of a woman whose chess pieces have just moved exactly as she designed. The fortnight was grandmother's doing, and she played it with the lightest possible hand, which was the most dangerous hand she had. She did not engineer further dinners. She did not manufacture encounters. She simply continued the ordinary life of Valcross Hall, morning walks in the yew garden, afternoons in the library, the occasional drive to the village. And Cora, as her companion, moved through it all with the quiet capability of someone who had learned not to take up too much room. Aldrich came to the hall, as he always did, 3 times that fortnight on estate business. It was not unusual. It was not arranged. Grandmother simply failed to prevent it from happening near times and places where Cora might also be. The second occasion, I was present myself. I had ridden over to return a set of survey maps, and I found my brother in the library mid-argument. Not a heated argument. Aldrich did not do heated arguments. A precise, clipped disagreement about the management of the estate's river weir, of all things, with a young woman in gray who was standing beside the open estate ledger with one finger on a column of figures, and a look of absolute certainty on her face. The notation here suggests the weir was last reinforced in the spring of 1814, she was saying, which would make it 11 years overdue for inspection by the steward's own schedule, which is recorded on the facing page. I am aware of the schedule. Then you will agree that the autumn flooding downstream is not mysterious. A pause. I had entered quietly enough that neither of them had noticed me, and I made a quick decision to remain unnoticed, locating myself behind the tall bookcase near the south window, where I was efficiently invisible and thoroughly entertained. You have been reading my estate ledgers, he said. Your grandmother asked me to cross-reference the household accounts against the estate records. I found the discrepancy incidentally. She said this without apology and without elaboration, which I could see surprised him more than the content of the observation itself. Most people, Discovering they had inadvertently wandered into something that belonged to the Duke of Valcross, produced apology with some urgency. She produced a clear explanation and waited. "The discrepancy," he repeated. "The weir and 3 other items on the north boundary. I made a note." She turned to the desk and produced a folded sheet of paper on which she had, in a clear and careful hand, listed 4 items with their ledger references and her recommended actions. The handwriting from my position behind the bookcase was both neat and rapid, the hand of someone who wrote often and with purpose, not for show. He took the paper. He read it. He read it again. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was recalculating something, and I recognized the particular quality of the silence because I had watched it precede a number of significant decisions over the course of my life. "You are not here as my estate manager," he said, and his tone was not unkind. But it was the tone of someone who is trying to locate the correct category for a thing that has not arrived in any expected category. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I am here as your grandmother's companion. The note is merely in case it is useful. You may discard it entirely if you find the presumption unwelcome." And she turned back to the household accounts as though the conversation were complete, not in dismissal, I thought, but in the manner of someone who has said what was true and does not feel the need to repeat it or defend it. I pretended to find my survey maps on the far shelf while my brother stood in the center of the library holding a sheet of paper and looking, for the first time in recent memory, as though he was not entirely certain where he stood. It was a remarkable thing to witness. I had not seen it since his first winter managing the estate, when he was 24 and learning the hard difference between authority and competence. He had been quick to close that gap in those days. I had the impression, watching him now, that he was quick to recognize it in others, too, when it appeared before him without warning and without any invitation to admire it. He came to me the next morning. This was itself unusual. Aldrich had never been the sort of man who came to his younger brother to say things aloud that he could not quite manage to organize in private. But he arrived at my rooms before breakfast, sat down in the wing chair by the window, and said, "Tell me about her." "Who?" I said out of pure habit. He gave me the look that had been perfecting itself since he was 12 years old. "She is an orphan," I said. "Father was the late Sir Caulfield of Devonswick, minor baronet, not much land, less money. He died 2 winters ago. The estate was sold to settle debts. She had an aunt who took her in briefly, but the aunt has since removed to Bath. She came to grandmother's attention through the charity committee, someone who knew someone. She has been earning her keep as a companion to elderly ladies. She is, by all accounts, capable, discreet, and difficult to rattle." He was quiet. "She has nothing," I added, because I thought it ought to be said clearly. "No portion, no connection, no one to speak for her. No one will be advocating her claim to anything. She is not here advocating it herself." "I know," he said. "She doesn't know she's being considered." "I know that too." Another silence. "Grandmother has not said a word to me about her since Sunday," he said, which was, I realized, what was bothering him most. Our grandmother in full campaign was maneuverable. Grandmother simply existing in the vicinity of a situation and saying nothing at all was a significantly more difficult opponent. "She told you the terms up front," I said. "Good mind, quiet character, not trying to catch a duke. I imagine she felt that covered it." He stood. He went to the window. Outside, the morning mist was still sitting in the low fields, and the yew garden below was empty except for the gardener's boy raking leaves. "She corrected my assessment of the weir," he said. "I was there. She was right." "Yes." He was quiet again for a long moment. "She didn't soften it." "No," I said, "she didn't." He left shortly after, and I sat with my cold tea, and thought that grandmother had, as usual, played the thing exactly right. She had simply put one honest person in the vicinity of a man who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who managed their words around him, and then stepped back and let the natural laws of the universe do the rest. He found her in the yew garden that afternoon. I was not there for this part. I have it from grandmother, who was watching from the upstairs window with the expression she wore when she felt she had earned a moment of self-satisfaction. He came through the gate at the east end of the garden, and she was on the bench near the sundial with a book open on her lap that she was not reading, because she was watching a robin on the path with the absorbed attention of someone who has learned to be grateful for small, ordinary things. He sat down on the far end of the bench without preamble. She did not appear startled. She marked her page. He said, "I am told," something to the effect that he owed her an apology for his tone in the library. She said he did not, that she had produced the note without invitation and he had been perfectly civil about it. He said he had not been civil, he had been dismissive, and he was aware of the difference. She looked at him then, grandmother said, for a long moment. Then she said that she accepted the apology if he was certain he wished to give one. He was, he said, certain. A pause, the robin flew off. She looked at the empty path where it had been. He asked her how long she intended to stay. She said the fortnight was nearly up, and she would return to her situation in Bristol. There was a widow in need of a companion at the end of the week. He asked whether she found the situation in Bristol agreeable. A longer pause this time. She said very quietly that she found it adequate, that it paid, that she was not in a position to be particular. He said nothing to that immediately. Grandmother says he sat with it for a full minute, which for Aldrich was an age. Then he said, "I was told you are not here to catch a duke." She looked at him with an expression that grandmother described as entirely composed and somewhere behind the composure, faintly amused. "I was told I was here to help with the household accounts," she said. "I have not been catching anything. Only correcting ledger discrepancies." He almost smiled. Grandmother is almost certain of it. He said, "Would you stay another fortnight?" She studied him for a moment. "As Lady Elspeth's companion," she said, "or in some other capacity that I ought to understand clearly before I answer." The precision of the question, grandmother told me later with very evident pleasure, was exactly what she had hoped for. The girl asked the thing directly, no pretending, no angling, just the clear question that needed asking. He answered it clearly. He said, "I would like to know you better. I am not certain yet what that means or where it leads. I will not make you a promise I cannot keep. But I would like more time, and I am asking for it honestly rather than manufacturing an excuse to keep you here." She was quiet for a moment. "That is," she said at last, "the most honest thing anyone has said to me in some years." She agreed to stay. The second fortnight was different. Not because anything was arranged, grandmother was wise enough to stop arranging, now that the mechanism had taken, but because my brother arrived at Valcross Hall more frequently, and on several occasions with no stated estate purpose at all, which was, for Aldrich, a remarkable thing. He was not a man who moved without purpose. He was not, as a general rule, a man who dropped in. He dropped in. Twice he arrived in the morning while Cora was in the garden with her book, and stayed through luncheon without apparent consciousness of having done so. Once he arrived at 4 in the afternoon, ostensibly to speak with the steward about the north boundary, and was still at the house at 7:30, at which point grandmother arranged for dinner to include 2 extra places with the serene efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this. I dined with them twice that fortnight. Cora did not perform for him. She did not angle her conversation to show herself to advantage, did not flatten her opinions to match his, and did not deflect when she had something to say. She contradicted him twice on questions of history, once on the subject of the Enclosure Acts, and once on a matter of Roman road construction in the northern counties that she had. It emerged, read rather more about than he had, was correct on both occasions, and received his acknowledgment of it with simple, unembellished pleasure that she did not try to hide or undersell. She simply looked pleased for a moment, and then returned to the argument. He brought her a book from the estate library, a collection of correspondence on agricultural reform that sounds bone dry, and was, in fact, exactly what she wanted, because she had mentioned in passing that she found the flood management literature she had been reading incomplete on the question of northern county drainage. He had remembered. He had gone to the library, found it, and brought it without announcement or ceremony, placing it on the side table beside her with only a brief, "I thought you might find this of use." She had looked at it, then at him. "The Hargrove letters," she said. "I have been trying to find a copy for 2 years." "They are not widely circulated," he said. She opened the cover. He watched her read the first page the way a man watches something he is not quite ready to name yet, but is no longer pretending not to see. She read 3/4 of it in 2 days and came to dinner with arguments drawn from it. Specific, annotated arguments, with references to the correspondence by date and correspondent. He came to dinner the following evening, specifically, to continue the argument. I watched this across a roast pheasant and thought that grandmother had not found my brother a wife. She had found him, for what might be the first time, an equal. Someone who did not manage her opinions around his title, did not soften her corrections to protect his composure, and did not perform interest she did not feel. It was, I thought, the rarest thing he could have been given. He had spent 20 years being certain that the world would arrange itself around him, and here was a person who had simply declined to do so, not in defiance, not even in awareness of it, but simply because it had not occurred to her that this was required. The night before she was to leave, she had decided she could not delay the Bristol situation indefinitely, and he had not yet asked her to, though I suspect they both knew the question was coming. I found him in the estate office, not working, just sitting. "Are you going to let her go to Bristol?" I said. "She is not mine to let or not let," he said. "Aldrich." A pause. He picked up the edge of the nearest ledger and set it down again. He was not a man who fidgeted, and the gesture was conspicuous. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and it cost him something to say it. I could hear that clearly. The Duke of Valcross did not admit uncertainty without effort. It was not in his nature, and it had not been trained into him. His nature had been trained the other direction for the better part of 3 decades. "I have spent 20 years being certain about everything. It was easier. People expect it of me. It requires nothing in return." "She will require something in return," I said. "She'll require honesty. She already asked you for it directly in the garden before she agreed to stay." "I know. That's not a difficult thing to give for a man who actually has it in him, and you do have it. You've always had it. You just stopped spending it on people who were unlikely to give it back." He said nothing to that. "She is going to marry that Bristol widow's nephew," I said. "Or someone like him, a solicitor, a clergyman. Someone without your advantages or your complications who will be grateful for her and show it plainly, because they won't have spent 20 years behind armor that they've forgotten how to take off." He looked at me. "I'm not saying it to be unkind," I said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and you know it's true, and she deserves someone who shows it plainly. If that person is going to be you, it is probably time to show it." He stood, he straightened his coat. He said, "Go away, Hugh." I went away with a fair degree of optimism. He found her in the hall, near the bottom of the main staircase, in her outdoor coat, which she had put on a quarter-hour early the way people do when they are not certain how to fill the time before a departure they are not entirely glad of. I was on the landing. I make no apology for it. He said her name. Just her name, the way that is either nothing at all or everything, depending on the person. She turned. He said, "I would like to speak plainly, and I would like you to tell me if I have misread anything, because I have been told I am sometimes obtuse, and I am choosing to trust that you will correct me if I am." She said very quietly that she would. He said that he did not want her to go to Bristol. He said that he had thought, over the last fortnight, about many practical considerations and many less practical ones, and that the practical ones were manageable, and the less practical ones were telling him something he thought he ought to listen to. He said that he could not offer her certainty about what he was or what he was capable of becoming, but that he could offer her honesty, and he could offer her a home, and if she were willing to consider the question of whether she might eventually, not now, not with any haste, be willing to consider him in return, he would like the chance to earn that consideration. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I was holding my breath. Then she said, "You are not, I think, as obtuse as you believe." He said, "I would like to be sure you understand what I am asking." She said, "You are asking whether I might be willing to stay, and whether, in time, I might be willing to become your Duchess." "Yes," he said. A pause. "You understand that I have nothing," she said, "no portion, no connection, no family to speak for me. The world will say you have lost your mind." "The world," he said, "has said worse about me and been wrong before." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The weir on the north boundary still needs inspecting." He said, "I know. I have arranged for the steward to go out Thursday." She said, "Good," and then she said, "Yes, I will stay." Grandmother, when I told her, though I suspect she already knew, she was very likely watching from the upstairs window again, said only, "Obviously," and returned to her correspondence. I have never in my life been able to determine whether our grandmother planned things in their particulars or simply saw very clearly what was true and put the right people in the same garden and waited. When I asked her once, she said the distinction was a philosophical one, and she found philosophy useful mainly as an after-dinner conversation topic. The wedding was in the spring. It was not a grand production. Grandmother vetoed grand productions on the grounds that they attracted the kind of people whose attention was not worth having. It was held in the estate chapel with 30 people present, most of them genuinely fond of one or both parties, and none of them there to assess or adjudicate. Lady Fenwhistle was not invited. The colonel was, because he had said something respectful about Cora's drainage observations, and grandmother remembered these things. I stood beside Aldrich at the front of the chapel and watched the door. She came in without fanfare, in deep ivory, simply dressed, no jewels except the garnet earrings that had been their mother's that Aldrich had given her the previous week, because he wanted her to have something of the family that was hers before the wedding and not after, so that it could not be called a performance for the room. He saw her and I saw his face, and I will not describe it in detail because some things belong only to the people who inhabit them. But I will say that the Duke of Valcross, who was afraid of very few things and maintained his composure through most of them, looked at the woman walking down the aisle of that small chapel as though every piece of armor he had ever made for himself had simply, all at once, become unnecessary. She reached the front. She looked at him. She was not crying. She was perfectly composed, in the way she was always perfectly composed, and behind the composure there was the warmth she did not bother to hide for him anymore. He said very quietly before the clergyman began, "I will not be easy to live with." She said equally quietly, "I have the ledgers organized and the north boundary scheduled for spring inspection. I expect I will manage." I believe the clergyman heard some of this because he smiled. They were married in the time it takes to say the things that matter. Grandmother lived another 7 years, which she spent in the satisfactory manner of a person who has arranged the world as well as it can be arranged, and is now watching it run. She came to Valcross Hall every Christmas, occupied her usual chair in the blue drawing room, and received reports on the estate's condition with the interest of someone who had once conducted the relevant survey work. The north boundary was inspected, reinforced, and did not flood. The Bristol widow wrote to inquire what had become of her promised companion. Aldrich wrote back himself, briefly, enclosing a donation to the Widows' and Orphans' Society that was, I am told, generous enough to fund the engagement of 3 alternative companions and leave something besides. Cora did not become a Grand Duchess in the performative sense. She became something more durable, the mistress of a house that ran well, the keeper of accounts that were accurate, the woman at the end of the table who contradicted the Duke of Valcross on questions of history and agricultural drainage, and 3 other subjects I have lost count of, and who received his acknowledgement of her corrections with the same small, unguarded smile she had produced for the clergyman at that first dinner, the one she quickly composed again before anyone else could see it. Anyone except my brother, who had stopped pretending not to see it sometime around the 2nd week. People said, as people will, that the Duke of Valcross had lost his mind, that he had thrown away a dynasty-building match for a penniless baronet's orphan with no connection, and no portion, and nothing to recommend her except her own character. They said it at dinners he was not attending, and in letters to people he was not corresponding with, and in the kind of rooms where opinions are formed in the confident absence of any relevant facts. He knew he did not trouble himself to care. I asked him once in the 2nd year of his marriage whether he ever regretted the dinner, whether he wished grandmother had found him someone with connections, a portion, a family prepared to see the alliance as a step forward. He looked at me with the particular look he reserved for questions he found unnecessary. She corrected my assessment of the weir, he said, before she had any reason to. I took his meaning. A person who will tell you the truth before they owe you anything is a rare and valuable person, and rarer still in the glittering and transactional world we had both grown up in, where truth was a thing to be managed, softened, redirected, anything except plainly offered. Grandmother knew, I said. Grandmother, he said, always knows. I believe he meant it as a complaint. He was smiling when he said it.